There is a place in southern Iraq where the land dissolves into water, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers slow and spread, fragmenting into countless channels that meander through vast beds of reeds. The horizon here is low and hazy, the sky immense, the air thick with moisture even in the heat of summer. This is the edge of the world, as the ancients knew it. The place where earth meets sea, where solid ground becomes uncertain, where the boundaries between elements blur and fade. The light here is different from anywhere else. In the early morning, before the heat becomes unbearable, mist rises from the water in ghostly columns, turning the landscape into something dreamlike, insubstantial. The reeds phragmites, some growing 15 feet tall, create walls of green and gold, rustling in the slightest breeze, their seeds floating on the water like snow. Birds are everywhere, herons standing motionless in the shallows, cormorants diving for fish, egrets picking their way through the mud. The air carries the smell of decay and growth mingled together, of standing water and vegetation, of life and death in constant cycle. This is not an easy landscape, it is not welcoming. The water is often brackish, undrinkable without treatment. The mud is deep and clinging, making every step an effort. In summer, the temperature can reach 125 degrees Fahrenheit. The air so hot and still that breathing becomes difficult. Mosquitoes swarm in clouds. Disease is endemic. There are no hills to climb for perspective, no elevated ground from which to survey the territory. Everything is flat, featureless, extending to the horizon in every direction. And yet, this hostile environment possesses an extraordinary fertility. Where the rivers flood, depositing their burden of silt, the soil becomes black and rich, capable of producing astonishing yields of grain. The waters teem with fish, carp, catfish, barbel. Waterfowl provide meat and eggs. The reeds themselves are a resource. They can be woven into mats, baskets, boats, even houses. In a land without stone or timber, the reed becomes the fundamental building material, versatile and abundant. It is here, in this unlikely place, that something unprecedented occurred, sometime around 4500 BC. Perhaps earlier, people stopped wandering and settled down permanently. The decision to settle in the marshes was not made lightly, nor was it made all at once. It evolved over generations, perhaps centuries, as small groups of hunter-gatherers returned season after season to the same favorable locations, gradually building more permanent structures, investing more labor in the landscape, creating ties to specific places that became harder to abandon. The process was slow, incremental, barely perceptible to those living through it. In winter, the marshes flood, and the water rises until entire landscapes vanish beneath its surface. The transformation is remarkable. What was solid ground in autumn becomes a vast inland sea, with only the highest mounds and reed beds visible above the water. The flooding is not uniform or predictable. Some years it is gentle, spreading gradually across the lowlands. Other years it is violent, the rivers swollen with snowmelt from distant mountains, breaking through embankments, inundating settlements, sweeping away everything in their path. The people learn to read the signs, the color of the water, the speed of the current, the behavior of animals, and to prepare accordingly, moving to higher ground when necessary, returning when the waters receded. In summer, the heat is crushing, and the mud bakes hard beneath the sun, cracking into geometric patterns, creating a landscape that looks almost ceramic, as if fired in some vast kiln. The glare off the water is blinding. The air shimmers with heat mirages, making distant objects appear to float above the horizon. During the hottest part of the day, from noon until late afternoon, all activity ceases. People and animals alike retreat to whatever shade they can find, waiting for the temperature to become bearable again. It is a time of endurance, of survival, of counting the days until the season turns and relief comes. Yet despite these extremes, despite the floods and the heat and the diseases and the insects, people have lived here for thousands of years. They built their homes on low mounds of earth that rise just high enough above the floodwaters to remain dry. Mounds that grew higher over time as generation after generation rebuilt on the same spot, adding layer upon layer of debris and collapsed buildings, creating tells that still dot the landscape today. They wove reeds into houses, constructing dwellings that were surprisingly durable, that could be built quickly when needed, that breathed in the heat and shed rain in the winter. They wove reeds into boats, elegant curved vessels that could navigate the shallowest channels, that could carry heavy loads, that became extensions of their bodies, as natural to them as walking. They fished with nets and spears and woven traps. They hunted waterfowl with throwing sticks and trained birds of prey. They gathered the eggs of wild birds, a rich source of protein. They grew barley and dates in the narrow strips of fertile soil that emerged when the waters receded, learning through trial and error which crops thrived, which planting times produced the best yields, which fields could be relied upon year after year. This is where civilization began. It is a strange thought, not in some fertile valley, with gentle climate and abundant resources, not in the mountains where defensible positions offered security, not in the forests where timber was plentiful, not along the coasts of the Mediterranean or the Nile where maritime trade could flourish easily, but here in the flatlands of southern Mesopotamia, in a place that must have seemed, to those who first settled it, both impossibly rich and impossibly hostile, a place where survival required constant vigilance, constant labor, constant cooperation. The soil, when watered at the right time and in the right amounts, was extraordinarily fertile. The rivers brought silt from distant highlands thousands of miles away, from the mountains of eastern Turkey, from the Zagros mountains of Iran, depositing nutrients accumulated over geological time. A single growing season could produce yields of barley 30 or 40 times the seed planted, numbers that would not be matched in Europe until the agricultural revolution of the 18th century. This fertility was not accidental, but the result of specific geological and hydrological conditions that existed nowhere else in quite the same way. But the rivers were also unpredictable, capricious, almost alive in their behavior. They flooded without warning, sometimes catastrophically. They changed course, abandoning old channels, carving new ones, leaving settlements that had been built on riverbanks suddenly high and dry, miles from water. They deposited salt along with silt, and in some areas, the salt accumulated over centuries until the soil became too saline to support crops, forcing abandonment. The relationship between people and rivers was complex, adversarial, and dependent at once. There were no trees for timber, at least not in the quantities needed for substantial construction. A few palms grew here and there, providing dates and fronds, but not wood suitable for beams. Willow and poplar grew along the riverbanks, but they were small, twisted, unreliable for anything requiring significant timber. Roof beams for large buildings, keels for substantial boats, furniture, tools, wood had to be imported from the mountains, a costly and difficult undertaking. The absence of timber shaped architecture, technology, even thought. Buildings were made of mudbrick, which imposed certain limitations but also offered certain possibilities. Boats were made of reeds waterproofed with bitumen, light and maneuverable but fragile. There was no stone for building, no granite or limestone or marble quarries from which to extract blocks. The nearest stone was in the mountains, hundreds of miles away. Small amounts were imported at enormous expense for special purposes: foundation stones for temples, door sockets, statues, seals. But ordinary construction relied entirely on mud. This too shaped the culture profoundly. There are no stone monuments from ancient Sumer, no carved reliefs on cliff faces, no megalithic structures. Everything was made from the earth, shaped by human hands, dried in the sun, and ultimately destined to return to earth when abandoned. Everything had to be made from mud and reeds. This seems like a limitation, and in some ways it was, but it was also liberating. Mud brick is easy to produce. Anyone can make it with minimal tools and training. It is readily available everywhere. It can be shaped into any form. It is an excellent insulator, keeping interiors cool in summer and warm in winter. Reeds are equally versatile, light, strong, flexible, and fast-growing. The Sumerians became masters of these materials, developing techniques that would be passed down for millennia, that are still used in some parts of Iraq today. And yet, around 4500 BC, perhaps even earlier, the dating is uncertain, based on radiocarbon analysis of organic materials and typological comparisons of pottery. People began to settle here permanently, not temporarily, not seasonally, but year-round, generation after generation. They built villages on raised platforms, small clusters of houses grouped together above the marshes, creating communities that would endure for centuries. They dug canals to control the water, engineering works that required communal labor, planning, leadership. The canals brought water where it was needed for irrigation and drained it away from areas prone to flooding. They were not massive public works projects at first, just small ditches, perhaps a few feet wide and deep, but they represented a conceptual leap, an understanding that the landscape could be modified, improved, made more amenable to human needs. These early canals required constant maintenance. Silt accumulated, reducing flow. Banks eroded, causing breaches. Reeds clogged the channels. Every year, probably in the slack period between harvest and planting, the entire community would turn out to clear the canals, to repair the banks, to keep the system functioning. This was collective labor, on a scale unprecedented in human history. It required coordination, cooperation, the subordination of individual interests to communal needs. It required someone to organize the work, to assign tasks, to ensure that everyone contributed fairly. The seeds of social hierarchy, of leadership, of government, lie here in these modest irrigation ditches. The people learned to work with the land's rhythms rather than against them. They observed, experimented, passed knowledge from one generation to the next. They learned which fields flooded, at which times, which soils were most fertile, which crops grew best, in which locations. They learned to predict the floods by watching the rivers upstream, by noting the timing of snowmelt in the distant mountains they had never seen. They learned that barley, not wheat, was the grain best suited to this environment, tolerant of salinity, capable of producing reliable yields even in difficult conditions. They learned that date palms, once established, could produce fruit for a century or more, providing a dependable food source that required relatively little labor after the initial planting. Generation after generation, they stayed. This persistence is itself remarkable. The natural human response to difficulty is to move, to seek easier circumstances elsewhere. But the people of the marshes stayed, and in staying, they changed both the landscape and themselves. The landscape became more ordered, more predictable, more productive. The people became more settled, more invested in particular places, more dependent on the infrastructure they had created. We don't know their names, we don't know what language they spoke, though it was probably an early form of Sumerian, a language that has no known relatives, that stands alone, and isolate, its origins lost in prehistory. We don't know what they called themselves, what myths they told, what songs they sang. Writing had not yet been invented. All we have is what they left behind, the physical traces of their existence, fragmentary and incomplete. The archaeological record from this period is fragmentary in the extreme. Potsherds scattered across the surface of tells, the foundations of walls emerging from eroded mounds, the remains of hearths and ovens exposed by wind and rain. Most sites from this era have never been excavated, or were excavated incompletely in the early 20th century, when archaeological methods were crude and much information was lost. Many have been destroyed by modern development, plowed under by farmers, built over by expanding towns and cities, looted for antiquities, damaged by war and neglect. But slowly, painstakingly, over more than a century of work, archaeologists have pieced together a picture of these early communities. The pottery they made was plain at first, functional rather than decorative, shaped by hand rather than on a wheel. The potter's wheel would not be invented for another 1,000 years. The vessels were simple bowls and jars, unglazed, fired in simple kilns, or even in open fires. The clay was local, dug from riverbanks, mixed with chopped straw or sand to prevent cracking during firing. The pots were used for cooking, for storage, for carrying water. They were utilitarian objects, made to be used and discarded when broken. Over time, perhaps over centuries, the pottery became more refined, levels became more uniform in size and shape, suggesting the use of molds or templates. Surfaces were smoothed, sometimes burnished to a shine. Decoration appeared, painted geometric patterns, simple bands and zigzags, cross-hatching. The clays used became more standardized, suggesting specific sources were favored. Firing temperatures increased, producing harder, more durable vessels. These changes might seem minor, but they indicate something profound, the emergence of craft specialization. Some individuals were now making pottery not just for their own families, but for exchange or sale. They were becoming potters, specialists, developing skills through practice, transmitting knowledge to apprentices, creating what we might call a professional identity. The villages grew larger over time. Excavations at sites like Eridu and Tel Ubaid show continuous occupation from around 5400 BC onward, with settlement areas expanding from a few acres to 20 or 30 acres over the course of a millennium. Populations must have numbered in the hundreds initially, growing eventually to thousands. Houses became more substantial, with stone foundations, the stone carried from distant quarries or scavenged from abandoned buildings. Walls became thicker, roofs more elaborate. Interior spaces became more differentiated, with separate areas for cooking, sleeping, storage, and work. Some buildings began to stand out from the others. They were larger, more carefully constructed, oriented in specific directions. Temples appeared, simple at first, small shrines made of mud brick, but unmistakably different from ordinary houses. They were recognizable as sacred spaces, set apart, special. They were oriented toward cardinal directions, with precision that suggests astronomical observation. They were built according to consistent plans, with altars in specific locations, niches for cult statues, offering tables for gifts to the gods. Most importantly, they were rebuilt on the same spots when they collapsed or were destroyed. This continuity speaks to something profound: the development of shared beliefs, of organized religion, of rituals that were passed down through generations. The concept of the temple as a permanent structure, rooted in a specific place, represents a revolution in human thought. Earlier religious practices, those of mobile hunter-gatherers, were necessarily portable. Sacred objects could be carried, rituals could be performed anywhere. But a temple is fixed, unmovable, tied to a particular plot of ground. Building a temple is a statement that this place is special, that this is where the god dwells, that people will return here, generation after generation. It is an investment in permanence, in continuity, in the future. And they did return. At Eridu, archaeologists found 19 successive temples built one atop another over more than 2,000 years. 19 rebuildings. 19 times the old temple was torn down or collapsed or burned, and 19 times it was rebuilt in the same location. Each rebuilding was larger, more elaborate, more impressive than the last, but the basic plan remained the same. The altar was always in the same position. The entrance always faced the same direction. The measurements, when analyzed, show mathematical relationships, suggesting the use of standard units, of planning, of architectural knowledge, passed from master to apprentice. This continuity is almost incomprehensible to modern minds. We live in a world of constant change, of buildings demolished and replaced, of fashions and styles turning over every few years. But for the people of Eridu, the temple was eternal, or as eternal as anything human can be. The rituals performed there were the same as those performed by their ancestors 1,000 years before. The god worshipped was the same god. The priests who served in the temple may have claimed direct descent from the first priests, their authority derived from that unbroken lineage. The landscape itself shaped the culture that emerged here in ways both obvious and subtle. The flatness of the land meant that visibility extended for miles in every direction when the air was clear. There were no natural fortifications, no mountains to retreat into, no forests to hide within when enemies approached. Defense required human effort: walls, watchtowers, organized militias, alliances with neighbors. Every settlement was vulnerable, exposed, dependent on its own strength and the strength of its allies. The abundance of water meant that agriculture was possible year-round in theory, though in practice the heat of summer made most fieldwork impossible. But the water also brought danger: floods, waterborne diseases, the endless labor of maintaining canals and dikes. The environment demanded cooperation. No single family, no matter how industrious, could dig and maintain the irrigation works necessary for successful farming. The task required dozens, eventually hundreds of people working together, coordinating their efforts, sharing the benefits. And so, slowly, over centuries that seemed to contemporaries like unchanging tradition, a particular form of social organization emerged. Leadership became more formalized, more institutionalized. Some individuals accumulated more wealth, more authority, more prestige. We can see this in the archaeological record, in graves that begin to show differences in burial goods. Some people were interred with jewelry, with fine pottery imported from distant regions, with copper tools and weapons, with stone vessels carved from exotic materials. Others had almost nothing: a simple shroud, a clay cup, perhaps a few beads. This is the beginning of social stratification, of inequality, of hierarchy. The rich graves are not randomly distributed. They tend to cluster near temples, suggesting that those who controlled religious institutions also controlled wealth. Or perhaps it was the other way around. Those with wealth built temples to legitimize their power, to connect themselves with the divine, to create an ideology that justified their elevated position. Either way, by 4000 BC, the outlines of a class society had emerged. There were elites and commoners, priests and farmers, wealthy and poor. This is the beginning of social inequality, of hierarchy, of the structures that would eventually crystallize into kingship and priesthood and bureaucracy. It is also the beginning of what we call civilization, a word that derives from the Latin civitas, meaning city, but that has come to mean something broader: a complex society with specialized roles, with institutions, with culture and learning, with the capacity to create lasting works of art and architecture and literature. But civilization, as we use the term, also implies something darker: the concentration of power, the exploitation of labor, the division of society into rulers and ruled. These developments went hand in hand, inseparable. You cannot have monumental architecture without massive labor forces, and you cannot organize massive labor forces without coercion of some kind, whether physical violence, economic necessity, religious obligation, or some combination. The temples of Sumer were built by thousands of workers laboring for months or years, and those workers did not volunteer out of altruism. They were compelled by duty, by debt, by force. By 4000 BC, the largest settlement in the region, the most important in both political and religious terms, was a place called Eridu. It sat on a low mound at the very edge of the marshes, near where the Euphrates emptied into the Persian Gulf, though the geography has changed dramatically since then, and the Gulf is now many miles away. According to later Sumerian tradition, written down more than 1,000 years after the fact, Eridu was the first city ever built, the original dwelling place of humanity, the spot where kingship first descended from heaven like rain. The god Enki, lord of wisdom, and of the subterranean freshwater ocean called the Abzu, was said to live there in his temple, deep beneath the earth, in the sweet waters that fed the wells and springs. Archaeology confirms that Eridu was indeed ancient, one of the oldest continuously inhabited settlements in Mesopotamia, occupied without interruption for thousands of years. When excavators dug into the mound in the 1940s and 1950s, a team led by Iraqi archaeologist Fouad Safar and British archaeologist Seaton Lloyd, they found layer upon layer of temples, each built directly on top of the ruins of the one before, creating a stratigraphic sequence that reached back into the mists of prehistory. The earliest structure, at the very bottom of the sequence, dated to around 5400 BC, according to pottery typology, a small shrine barely 10 feet square, with an offering table and a niche for a cult statue or sacred symbol. It would have accommodated only a handful of people, perhaps just the priest and a few attendants. There were no windows, only a single doorway. Light came from oil lamps or from the doorway itself. The walls were plain mud, brick, undecorated, functional. Over the centuries, this temple was rebuilt again and again, each time larger, more elaborate, more permanent, more impressive. By 4000 BC, it had become a massive structure, raised on a platform that lifted it above the surrounding houses and workshops, making it the visual focal point of the settlement. The platform was a symbolic mountain, connecting earth and heaven, profane and sacred. To reach the temple, one had to climb a staircase, passing from the ordinary world into the divine realm. The building itself now had multiple rooms and courtyards. Walls were decorated with cone mosaics, thousands of small clay cones pressed into the mudbrick surface, their ends painted in different colors, creating intricate geometric patterns of zigzags, diamonds, triangles. The labor involved in creating these mosaics was immense, each cone individually made, painted, inserted. The effect must have been stunning, especially in the low-angle light of dawn or dusk, when shadows emphasized the three-dimensional texture. The continuity is striking and demands explanation. For more than 2,000 years, the people of Eridu returned to the same spot, tore down the old temple or built over its ruins, and constructed a new one in its place. Why? The rituals performed there must have been the same, or nearly so, transmitted without significant alteration across dozens of generations. The god they worshipped was the same Enki, lord of fresh waters, patron of craftsmen and scholars, trickster and benefactor. The priests who performed the ceremonies may even have claimed descent from those who had served before them, their authority validated by genealogy, their knowledge secret and exclusive, passed from master to apprentice in an unbroken chain. This is the deep conservatism of ancient religion, the sense that certain things must be done in certain ways because they have always been done that way, because the gods demand it, because to change or innovate would be to invite disaster, to break the cosmic order, to risk the anger of the divine. In a world without science, where the reasons for things were mysterious, where harvests failed for no apparent reason, and diseases struck without warning, maintaining the proper relationship with the gods through correct ritual was a matter of survival. The temple was the point of contact between human and divine, the place where the boundary could be crossed, where offerings could be made and blessings received. Walking through the ruins of Eridu today, or rather standing at the edge of them, for much remains buried beneath sand and scrub, and the site is difficult to access. One is struck first by the silence. The site is remote, profoundly isolated, far from any modern city or even sizable village. The nearest paved road is miles away. To reach Eridu requires driving across desert tracks, navigating around dunes and gullies, crossing terrain that looks unchanged since ancient times. The wind blows constantly here, carrying dust from the desert, a fine grit that gets into everything: eyes, mouth, lungs. The landscape is monochrome, shades of brown and tan and pale gold, broken only occasionally by scrubby vegetation, clinging to life in wadis, where water occasionally runs. The ruins themselves are not immediately impressive to the untrained eye. There is a large mound, yes, rising perhaps 30 or 40 feet above the surrounding plain, covering several acres. But it looks like a natural formation at first glance, just another low hill in a landscape of low hills. Only when you look more carefully do you begin to see the traces of human habitation: fragments of brick protruding from eroded slopes, depressions that mark ancient streets or courtyards, scatters of pottery sherds glinting in the sun. The bricks are sun-dried mud, weathered to the point where they're barely distinguishable from the earth around them. The colors are muted, faded by millennia of exposure to wind and rain and scorching heat. In the 1940s and 50s, when excavations were underway, much more would have been visible. Trenches cut deep into the mound-exposed walls, revealed room plans, brought to light artifacts that had lain undisturbed for 5,000 years. Photographs from that era show archaeologists standing in excavated temple structures, walls rising to shoulder height or above, doorways and niches clearly visible. But after the excavations ended, the trenches were backfilled or left open to collapse naturally. Wind and rain did their work. Today, only fragments remain visible, and even those are slowly eroding, melting back into the earth from which they came. The marshes have receded from Eridu, the rivers have shifted their courses, as they do over time, following new paths dictated by subtle changes in elevation and the accumulation of silt. The Persian Gulf, once visible from the highest point of the city, is now many miles away, separated from the site by desert and desiccated marshland. The landscape has changed dramatically since ancient times, making it difficult to visualize what Eridu would have looked like in its heyday. A thriving settlement surrounded by green fields and date palms, canals glinting with water, boats coming and going, smoke rising from hundreds of cooking fires, the sounds of commerce and worship and daily life. But once, this was a thriving center, a place of pilgrimage, a city whose name was known throughout the land and spoken with reverence. Once, people journeyed here from distant regions to worship at Enki's temple, to seek the god's favor, to participate in festivals that drew crowds from across the region. Once, this was the center of the world, or at least it seemed so to those who lived here. The temple rose above everything else, its white plastered walls visible for miles, a landmark, a beacon, a symbol of divine presence and human aspiration. What was it like to live in Eridu in those early days, in the millennia before writing, when the only records were those preserved in memory and tradition? The houses were made of mudbrick, their walls thick, sometimes 3 feet thick or more, to provide insulation against the heat of summer and the cold of winter nights. Roofs were flat, constructed of wooden beams, imported at great cost from the mountains, laid across the tops of walls, covered with reeds, and then a thick layer of mud that was trampled flat and allowed to dry. These roofs had to be maintained constantly, the mud replastered every year or two to prevent leaks when rain came. In summer, people slept on these roofs, when the interiors became unbearable ovens, lying on reed mats under the stars, catching whatever breeze might stir the air. The streets were narrow and winding, unpaved, turning to dust in summer and mud in winter, following no obvious plan, but rather having evolved organically over generations as houses were built and rebuilt, as neighbors negotiated boundaries, as footpaths became permanent thoroughfares. Some streets were barely wide enough for 2 people to pass, forcing neighbors into constant proximity, into a degree of intimacy that modern urban dwellers would find intolerable. Privacy as we understand it did not exist. Lives were lived in public, or in the semi-public space of courtyards, where neighbors could easily see and hear what was happening. There were no windows in the exterior walls. Windows would have let in heat and dust and compromised security. Light came through the doorway, often the only opening in the outer wall, and from small openings near the roofline that allowed hot air to escape and provided ventilation. Inside, the houses were dim, cool, cave-like. Eyes adjusted slowly when entering from the bright sunlight outside. The air smelled of cooking smoke, of bodies, of the earth itself. The walls, after all, were made from the same mud that covered the floor, that clung to feet and hands. That was omnipresent. Families cooked in courtyards when weather permitted, or in a room set aside for that purpose when it did not. They baked bread in dome-shaped ovens, tanner ovens, which are still used in the region today, their design essentially unchanged over 5 millennia. The oven was made of clay, built up in coils, fired to harden it, creating a structure about 3 feet high, with an opening at the bottom for fuel and a larger opening at the top. Fire was built inside using whatever fuel was available: dried reeds, animal dung, occasionally scraps of wood. When the interior was hot enough, flat rounds of dough were slapped onto the interior walls, where they stuck and baked quickly, emerging as bread, the staff of life, eaten at every meal, so fundamental that the Sumerian word for food and the word for bread were the same. They kept goats and sheep in pens attached to their homes, or in corrals at the edge of the settlement. The animals provided milk, which was consumed fresh or processed into yogurt and cheese. They provided wool, shorn annually, washed and carded, and spun by women and children, woven into cloth on simple vertical looms. And eventually, when they grew old, or when meat was needed for a festival or sacrifice, they provided food. Butchering was a communal activity, the meat shared among neighbors, according to established custom, nothing wasted. Even bones were cracked open for marrow, even hides were tanned and used. The temple dominated the city, both physically and spiritually, towering above the surrounding structures, its mass and height proclaiming its importance. It was the largest building, the tallest, the most elaborately decorated, the most carefully maintained. It stood on a raised platform, and to reach it, one had to climb a staircase of mudbrick, wide enough for processions, rising gradually from the level of the street to the level of the platform, perhaps 15 or 20 feet of elevation. This climb was itself a ritual act, a movement from the profane world below to the sacred space above. Each step took the worshipper further from ordinary life, closer to the divine. At the top of the stairs were gates, perhaps wooden, perhaps simply openings flanked by towers. Passing through, one entered a courtyard, open to the sky, paved with brick, kept swept and clean. Here the general public could gather during festivals, could witness from a distance the rituals performed by priests. But beyond the courtyard were inner spaces, progressively more restricted, less accessible. A second courtyard, smaller, accessible only to certain individuals. Then covered corridors, cool and dim after the bright sunlight outside. Then chambers, storerooms, workshops, where ritual objects were prepared. And finally, at the heart of the complex, the sanctuary itself, the innermost chamber where the god's statue stood, where only the highest priests could enter, where the most sacred rituals were performed in secrecy. Inside, the air was cooler, by perhaps 10 or 15 degrees, the thick walls and lack of windows providing insulation. The air was darker too, vision adjusting slowly to the dimness, details emerging gradually, painted walls, offering tables laden with food and flowers, braziers burning fragrant resins that filled the space with smoke and scent. The combination of limited light, aromatic smoke, and the solemn atmosphere would have been overwhelming to someone entering for the first time, designed to inspire awe, to create a sense of the numinous, to make tangible the presence of the divine. Priests moved through these corridors and chambers, performing rituals whose exact nature we can only guess at from later texts and comparative evidence from other ancient Near Eastern cultures. There were daily rituals, the feeding of the god at dawn and dusk, offerings of food and drink, the changing of the god's clothes, the cleaning of the sanctuary. There were monthly rituals tied to the lunar calendar, marking the new moon, the full moon, other significant phases. There were seasonal rituals tied to the agricultural year, planting, harvest, the flooding of the rivers, and there were extraordinary rituals performed in times of crisis, drought, disease, war, natural disaster, intended to appease the gods, to discover what had angered them, to restore the proper cosmic order. The god's statue stood in the innermost chamber of the temple, carved from wood or molded from clay or shaped from stone, materials depending on what was available and what the community could afford. The statue was not merely a representation of the god, but was understood in some sense to be the god, or at least the god's body, the physical form through which the divine presence manifested in the human world. The statue's eyes were particularly important, often inlaid with shell and lapis lazuli, or other semi-precious stones, carefully crafted to appear alive, to seem to follow the viewer. To look into the god's eyes was to encounter the god, to be seen by the god, to enter into relationship with the divine. The god was not a distant, abstract presence, dwelling in some remote heaven. The god lived in the temple, inhabited the statue, ate the food that was offered, wore the clothes that were woven for it, listened to the prayers that were spoken, smelled the incense that was burned. The temple was the god's house, as literal as that phrase can be. The city belonged to the god, was the god's property. The land, the people, the crops, the livestock, all were under divine ownership. Humans were tenants, stewards, servants of the divine landlord. The priests managed the god's estate on the god's behalf, collecting tithes and offerings, organizing labor for temple-building projects, and agricultural work on temple lands, redistributing goods to support priests, craftsmen, and others who worked for the temple. In this way, religion and economics were inseparable. Two aspects of a single system. The temple was not just a place of worship, but also a warehouse, a granary, a bank, a redistributive center, an administrative headquarters. The priests were not just religious officials, but also accountants, managers, judges, diplomats. This conflation of sacred and secular, so strange to modern sensibilities, shaped by centuries of institutional separation of church and state, was natural and inevitable to the Sumerians. The gods owned everything, controlled everything, determined everything. To manage the gods' property was a religious duty. To collect the gods' revenues was an act of piety. To organize the gods' workers was to perform a sacred service. There was no sphere of life that was not ultimately religious, no activity that did not in some way involve or reference the divine. Eridu was not alone in this. By 4000 BC, by the time Eridu's temple had reached truly monumental proportions, other settlements had grown up along the rivers and canals of southern Mesopotamia, each following a similar pattern. Each had its own patron deity, its own temple growing larger generation by generation, its own agricultural hinterland supporting its urban population, its own priests and craftsmen and traders. They were linked by trade, by shared language and culture, even if that culture was not yet uniform, even if regional variations existed. They were linked by intermarriage, as families sought alliances and connections beyond their immediate community. They were linked by conflict, as disputes over land and water and resources erupted into raids and skirmishes, and occasionally into full-scale war. This was not yet a unified state, not a kingdom in any sense we would recognize, not an empire. It was a network of independent communities, each self-sufficient in most respects yet connected, each aware of the others, each competing for resources and prestige and divine favor. The political geography was fluid, with stronger settlements dominating weaker neighbors temporarily, extracting tribute or labor, imposing their authority, only to see that authority collapse when the strong leader died, or when circumstances changed. Alliances formed and dissolved, boundaries shifted. The balance of power was constantly in flux. The landscape between these settlements was not empty wilderness, but a mosaic of cultivated fields, palm groves, pastureland, and managed wetlands. Fields of barley stretched out in every direction during the growing season, green in spring when the plants were young, turning golden in early summer as they ripened, the grain heads heavy and nodding in the breeze. The transformation was swift within the space of a few weeks. The fields went from green to gold to stubble, harvested by teams of workers using flint sickles, the blades set into wooden or bone handles, sharp enough to slice through stems, but requiring frequent resharpening. After the harvest, the stubble was burned, the ash adding nutrients to the soil, and the fields lay fallow until the next planting season. Date palms grew along the canal banks in orderly rows, their trunks rising straight and branchless until reaching heights of 30 or 40 feet, where fronds exploded in green profusion, casting welcome shade on the ground below. Date palms are extraordinary plants, adapted perfectly to this environment, tolerant of heat, capable of surviving on relatively little water once established, productive for decades or even centuries. A mature palm can produce more than 100 pounds of dates annually, providing concentrated calories, natural sweetness, and fruit that keeps well when dried. The dates were harvested in autumn, a time of communal effort and celebration, climbers scaling the trunks using ropes or notches cut into the bark, cutting down the heavy clusters of fruit, lowering them to workers below. Sheep and goats grazed in the stubble after the harvest, or on land too marginal for crops, areas where salt concentration was too high, where irrigation was impractical, where the soil was too sandy or too heavy with clay. These animals were remarkably adapted to the environment, capable of surviving on vegetation that cattle could not digest, able to go without water for extended periods. They were herded by children or young men, guided with thrown stones and shouts, kept moving to prevent overgrazing, brought back to pens at night, for protection from predators, jackals, hyenas, occasionally lions, which were not yet extinct in Mesopotamia, and still roamed the marshes and reed beds. Villages dotted the countryside between the larger settlements, small clusters of houses, where farmers lived in extended family groups, walking out to their fields each morning, returning at dusk. These villages were not mere satellites of the cities, but had their own identities, their own community structures, their own small shrines to local deities. Life in these villages changed more slowly than in the cities, traditions persisting for generations, innovations spreading gradually, if at all. An archaeologist excavating one of these sites finds remarkable continuity. The same house plans repeated over centuries, the same pottery styles, the same tools, suggesting a conservative culture resistant to change, valuing stability and tradition over novelty. The rivers were highways, vital arteries of communication and trade. Boats moved constantly up and down them, taking advantage of currents and winds, carrying grain from agricultural regions to cities, fish from the marshes to inland markets, reeds for construction, bitumen for waterproofing, pottery, textiles, tools. The boats themselves were remarkable, made primarily of reeds bundled together and lashed into shape. Their hulls waterproofed with bitumen, lightweight yet capable of carrying substantial loads. Larger boats had wooden frames, the wood imported at great expense, covered with reed mats coated in bitumen. These vessels required constant maintenance. The reeds rotted and had to be replaced. The bitumen coating cracked and needed renewal, but they were perfectly adapted to the shallow, constantly shifting waters of the Mesopotamian rivers. It was a world built on water and mud, on constant labor, on the collective effort of thousands. It was a world where the margin between sufficiency and want was narrow, where a failed harvest meant hunger, where disease and accident were constant threats, where life expectancy was short and infant mortality high. But it was also a world of remarkable achievement, of communities that had learned to thrive in a challenging environment, of people who had developed sophisticated technologies and social institutions, who had created art and architecture, and eventually, writing. And it was a world that was changing, though the changes were gradual enough that no single generation would have perceived them as revolutionary. Population was growing slowly but steadily. Settlements were expanding. Trade networks were lengthening, reaching further into the mountains for timber and stone, further across the deserts for exotic materials. Social hierarchies were becoming more pronounced, the gap between rich and poor widening, and in one particular place, these trends were converging to create something unprecedented. By 3500 BC, one city had grown larger than all the others, dwarfing even Eridu in size and population and influence. Its population was swelling to numbers previously unimaginable. Its temples were grander than any built before. Its economic networks extended across hundreds of miles. This was Uruk, and it would become the first true city the world had ever seen. The prototype for urban civilization, the place where writing would be invented, and where many of the fundamental patterns of civilized life would be established. The ruins of Uruk lie in the desert of southern Iraq, roughly halfway between modern Baghdad and Basra, far from any modern settlement, surrounded by emptiness that extends to the horizon in every direction. From a distance, approaching across the flat desert, the site appears as a low mound, a darker smudge against the pale earth, barely distinguishable from natural topography. Heat mirages shimmer in the air, making distances difficult to judge, making the mound seem to float and waver. The silence is profound, broken only by wind. Up close, the scale becomes apparent and overwhelming. The mound covers nearly 1,000 acres, more than a square mile, the accumulated debris of 5 millennia of continuous occupation. Buildings rose, collapsed, were demolished, were built over. Generations lived, died, left their trash and their treasures, their bones and their artifacts. Layer upon layer, the ground level rose slowly over centuries until the ancient city sat atop a hill of its own making, 20 or 30 or 40 feet above the surrounding plain. The surface is littered with pottery sherds, millions of them, crunching underfoot with every step, fragments of storage jars, cooking pots, serving vessels, lamps. Some are glazed, from relatively recent Islamic periods. Others are plain, thick, crude, from the earliest periods of settlement. Each represents a moment in someone's life. A meal prepared, a drink poured, a lamp lit against the darkness. In its heyday, around 3,500 to 3000 BC, during what archaeologists call the late Uruk period, this city was home to perhaps 40,000 people, a staggering number for that time, unprecedented in human history. No settlement had ever approached this size. The largest communities of earlier periods had numbered in the low thousands at most. But Uruk had exploded in population and in area, sprawling across the landscape, its influence extending hundreds of miles in every direction. Walking through the site today, one sees fragments of walls protruding from the earth at odd angles, eroded by wind and rain and time until they're barely recognizable as human construction. The outlines of massive structures, are barely visible beneath sand and wind-blown soil, their true extent revealed only through excavation and careful mapping. But in the early 20th century, when German archaeologists first began excavating here, work that continued with interruptions for over a century, they uncovered something extraordinary: enormous temples covering acres of ground, towering ziggurats that would have been visible for 20 miles across the flat landscape, intricate mosaics decorating walls and columns, vast administrative complexes filled with thousands of clay tablets inscribed with the earliest known writing, sophisticated hydraulic engineering works, and evidence of industrial-scale craft production. The most impressive structure excavated was the White Temple, so called because its mud-brick walls were covered entirely with white gypsum plaster that would have gleamed in the sun, visible from miles away, a beacon and a landmark. It stood on top of a 40-foot-high platform, an artificial mounting constructed of millions of mud bricks, dominating the city and the landscape beyond, asserting through sheer mass and height the power of the gods and those who served them. To reach the temple, worshippers had to climb a monumental staircase, not a single straight flight, but a complex arrangement of ramps and landings, zigzagging up the face of the platform, designed to extend the journey, to make the ascent gradual and ceremonial, to separate step by step the profane world below from the sacred space above. The procession ascending these stairs must have been magnificent. Picture it: priests in white linen robes, their heads shaved, or their hair braided in complex patterns, moving in measured steps, chanting hymns in unison, musicians with lyres and drums, their instruments decorated with gold and silver, providing a rhythmic accompaniment that echoed off the temple walls, attendants carrying offerings, baskets of dates and grain, jars of beer and oil, trussed animals for sacrifice, flowers, incense. The king himself, if it was a major festival, dressed in wool embroidered with gold thread, wearing a headdress or crown, flanked by bodyguards with spears. The crowd below, thousands strong, watching from the streets and plazas, participating from a distance in the sacred drama being enacted above them, their voices joining in refrains of hymns, their bodies swaying in rhythm with the music. At the top of the stairs, passing through gateways flanked by towers, one entered a courtyard, open to the sky, paved with baked brick, expensive and durable, made by firing the bricks in kilns rather than simply drying them in the sun. The courtyard was kept meticulously clean, swept daily, washed during festivals. Here the general public could gather during important ceremonies, could see the temple's entrance, could smell the incense and hear the prayers, could feel themselves part of the community united in worship. Beyond the courtyard, through massive wooden doors, timber imported from mountains hundreds of miles away, carved and decorated, hung on bronze hinges, lay the temple proper. The building was relatively small for such an important structure, a single rectangular room, about 60 feet long and 30 feet wide. But its position, its height above the city, its gleaming white walls, these made it the visual and spiritual center of Uruk. Inside, the walls were painted with murals, now lost, showing processions and rituals and divine beings. An altar stood at one end, stained with the blood of countless sacrifices. A podium for the cult statue stood at the other end, the statue itself probably of wood covered with gold leaf or precious metals. Its eyes of shell and lapis, its body dressed in finest cloth, its presence radiating divine power. Uruk was not just large, it was complex in ways that transcended mere size. The city was divided into distinct quarters, or neighborhoods, each with its own character, its own economy, its own social composition. There was the temple district, dominated by the Inanna complex, the temple of Inanna, goddess of love and war, a sprawling sacred precinct that eventually covered nearly 30 acres, one of the largest religious complexes ever built in ancient Mesopotamia. Within Inanna were multiple temples, shrines, administrative buildings, workshops, storerooms, courtyards, all arranged according to carefully planned layouts, all maintained by staffs of priests and workers numbering in the hundreds. There were residential areas, dense neighborhoods of tightly packed houses separated by narrow alleys, similar in basic structure to those at Eridu and other earlier settlements, but built more closely together, more uniformly, suggesting planning or at least oversight. Regulations about building methods and street widths. Excavations in these areas reveal homes of various sizes, some quite large with many rooms, suggesting wealthy families, others tiny single-room structures suggesting poverty, or perhaps housing for workers employed by temples or workshops. There were industrial zones where craftsmen worked in workshops often attached to temples or large estates, producing goods not just for local consumption, but for export. Potters worked in one quarter, Their kilns fired constantly, producing the distinctive pottery that archaeologists call the Uruk style, simple, mass-produced bowls and jars that have been found hundreds of miles from the city, evidence of long-distance trade. Weavers worked in another area, their vertical looms producing bolts of linen and wool cloth. Metal workers had their own district, their furnaces blazing, their hammers ringing as they shaped copper into tools and weapons, eventually beginning to experiment with alloying copper with arsenic or tin to produce bronze. There was a harbour district, where boats arrived from upstream and downstream, unloading cargoes from distant regions, timber from the Zagros and Taurus mountains, where cedar and pine grew, stone from quarries in Syria and Iran, metals from Anatolia and Afghanistan, semi-precious stones from various sources. These goods were exchanged for Uruk's agricultural surplus, barley and dates produced by temple estates and brought into the city as tax or tribute, and for manufactured goods produced by its workshops. And there was a market, probably multiple markets, where ordinary citizens bought and sold goods, bartered and haggled, conducted the routine transactions of daily life. These markets left little archaeological trace. They were open-air affairs, requiring no permanent structures, but they must have existed, must have been loud and crowded and colourful, filled with the smells of fresh bread and roasted meat, of perfumes and incense, of leather and wool, of fish and dates, of humanity pressed together in commerce and conversation. The pottery from Uruk is distinctive and tells us much about how the city functioned, about the scale of its operations, about the organization of its economy. Thousands of identical beveled rim bowls have been found at Uruk and at sites throughout the Uruk cultural sphere. Simple vessels, crudely made, mass-produced on a scale never seen before in human history. These bowls are so uniform that they must have been made in molds or from standardized templates. The clay was local, minimally processed. You can see bits of chaff and sand in the fabric. The surfaces are rough, unfinished. The firing was quick and low temperature, producing vessels that were technically ceramics but barely so, fragile and porous. Why produce thousands upon thousands of such crude vessels, when individual potters could have made far superior bowls? The answer lies in their function. These were not heirloom pieces, not objects to be cherished and preserved. They were disposable, single-use containers, the ancient equivalent of paper plates. Each bowl held a standardized ration, about a liter of barley, or beer, or oil. They have been found in enormous quantities near temples and workshops, suggesting they were used to pay workers in kind, filled with food, and distributed at the end of a workday. This system of rationing implies centralized control, bureaucratic management, large-scale mobilization of labor. Think about what this means. Uruk was employing thousands of workers simultaneously on various projects, building temples, digging canals, maintaining walls, producing goods in workshops. These workers needed to be fed, and the system that developed was one of standardized rations distributed in standardized containers. Every day, perhaps at sunset, when work ended, workers would line up to receive their payment: a bowl of barley, a bowl of beer, perhaps some dates or dried fish. The bowl itself had no value, was thrown away or left to break, eventually becoming part of the archaeological record that allows us to reconstruct this system millennia later. The uniformity speaks to an astounding level of organization, of bureaucracy, of administration. Someone had to calculate how much food was needed. Someone had to organize the collection of agricultural surplus from temple estates and from taxes paid by farmers. Someone had to organize storage, inventory, distribution. Someone had to keep track of who worked, how many days, and therefore earned how many rations. This requires records, requires writing, or at least requires some system sophisticated enough to manage the complexity. And indeed, standardization appears in many aspects of Uruk's material culture. Bricks were produced in standard sizes, allowing builders to work more efficiently, to create structures that fit together precisely. Cylinder seals, small carved stones that could be rolled across clay to leave an impression, were produced in workshops, their designs showing remarkable consistency of style and technique, suggesting organized production under master craftsmen who trained apprentices in established methods. Even in architecture, there's standardization. Temple plans follow consistent patterns, room dimensions recur, suggesting the existence of architectural knowledge that was codified and transmitted, perhaps through drawings or models, perhaps through oral instruction from master builders to apprentices. This standardization, this mass production, suggests something that might be called industrial capitalism in embryonic form. The organization of production, not by individual craftsmen working independently, but by large institutions, temples, estates, employing many workers, using standardized techniques to produce standardized goods, operating at scales that generated surplus for trade. It suggests an economy that had moved beyond simple subsistence, beyond household production, into something more complex and more hierarchical. And indeed, it was in Uruk, in the Anna temple complex, around 3200 BC, though some scholars would date it slightly earlier or later, that writing was invented, that humanity took one of its most significant steps, that the silence of prehistory was finally broken. The invention did not happen suddenly, was not the work of a single genius, but emerged gradually from accounting systems that had been developing for centuries. For generations, perhaps for millennia, people had used small clay tokens to keep track of goods and transactions. Holdini. These tokens came in various shapes: spheres, cones, discs, cylinders, each shape representing a different commodity. A sphere might represent a measure of grain, a cone might represent a jar of oil, a cylinder might represent an animal. The tokens were a three-dimensional accounting system, physical representations of quantities that could be manipulated, counted, stored. When goods were transferred, when a farmer paid tax to a temple, when workers received rations, when merchants traded, the appropriate number of tokens would be exchanged. To make a permanent record of a transaction, tokens would be placed inside a hollow clay ball called a bulla, which was then sealed. The outside of the bulla might be marked to indicate what was inside, or who was involved in the transaction. But there was a problem: to verify what was inside, you had to break the bulla, destroying the record. At some point, probably sometime around 3500 BC, someone realized that instead of placing tokens inside a clay ball, you could simply press the tokens into the surface of a flat clay tablet, leaving impressions. The physical tokens could be set aside, and the impressions themselves became the record. This was revolutionary. It transformed a three-dimensional accounting system into a two-dimensional one, making records much easier to create, store, and reference. Over time, perhaps over several generations, these impressions became more abstract, more stylized, evolving into pictographs, simplified images of the things they represented. Instead of pressing an actual token into the clay, scribes drew the shape with a pointed tool. A pictograph of a head with a hat meant a person, specifically a male person, perhaps a worker. A pictograph of a bowl meant food or a meal. A pictograph of grain stalks meant barley. A pictograph of a star, which in the night sky of Mesopotamia was associated with divinity, came to mean heaven, God, or the divine in general. The earliest tablets from Uruk, dating to around 3200 BC, are largely administrative, inventories, receipts, accounts. They record quantities of goods moving in and out of the Anna temple complex. 300 measures of barley received from such and such estate. 50 jars of oil distributed to such and such workshop. 120 workers employed for 3 days. The tablets are small, usually just a few inches across, made from clay that was deliberately mixed to be smooth and fine, easy to mark. They were inscribed while the clay was still soft, then left to dry or occasionally fired in a kiln to make them permanent. Many were probably meant as temporary records, useful for a season or a year, then discarded when no longer needed. But even discarded tablets often survive, thrown into trash heaps, where they were baked hard by subsequent fires, or simply buried and preserved in the dry soil. At first, these early tablets recorded only quantities and objects. They could not record names, verbs, grammatical particles, anything abstract. They were lists, catalogues, not sentences. But gradually, the system expanded and became more sophisticated. Pictographs were combined to create new meanings, to express concepts that couldn't easily be depicted. The sign for mouth, combined with the sign for bread, meant to eat. The sign for mouth, combined with the sign for water, meant to drink. Abstract concepts could be represented by association or by rebus, using a sign for its sound rather than its meaning. A foot meant to go or to stand, but it could also represent the sound of the word for foot, allowing it to be used in words that had nothing to do with actual feet. Numbers were indicated by different-sized impressions made with a stylus. A small circle meant 1, a larger circle meant 10, a large circle with a smaller circle inside it meant 60. The Sumerians, and later the Babylonians and Assyrians who inherited their mathematical system, used a sexagesimal system, base 60 rather than base 10. This seems strange to us, but it has certain advantages. 60 is evenly divisible by many numbers, making calculations easier. We still use base 60 for measuring time and angles: 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle, inheritance from the Sumerians that persists after 5,000 years. Within a few generations, certainly by 3000 BC, the writing system had evolved to the point where it could represent spoken language. Scribes could now write not just inventories, but instructions, letters, legal documents, prayers, myths. The pictographs had become increasingly abstracted, simplified into combinations of wedge-shaped marks, pressed into clay with a reed stylus cut at an angle, hence the name cuneiform, from the Latin cunis meaning wedge. The script could be written relatively quickly by someone trained, and thousands of people were trained. Scribal schools were established where boys, almost always boys, though there's evidence of a few female scribes, spent years learning the complex script, memorizing hundreds of signs and their various meanings and pronunciations, practicing by copying standard texts over and over until the signs became automatic. This was not yet true writing in the fullest sense. The earliest tablets from Uruk are still limited, still primarily administrative, still struggling to represent the full complexity of spoken language. But they were the beginning, the foundation upon which all subsequent development would build. Within a few centuries, certainly by 2500 BC, Sumerian scribes could write anything: stories, poems, songs, laws, contracts, letters, astronomical observations, mathematical calculations, medical diagnoses. Anything that could be expressed in language could now be written down and preserved. The invention of writing was not an act of genius by a single individual, not a eureka moment, but a slow collective process driven by pragmatic needs. The need to keep track of temple revenues, to record transactions, to manage complex economic operations. But its consequences were profound, world-changing, revolutionary. Writing changed everything. It allowed knowledge to be preserved and transmitted across time and space with unprecedented accuracy. It made possible the keeping of historical records, the codification of laws, the composition of literature. It created a new class of specialists, scribes, whose skills gave them power and status. It fundamentally altered how humans related to their past and their future, creating a sense of continuity, of accumulation of knowledge, of progress. For the first time, human thoughts and words could be captured and made permanent, could survive the death of the thinker, could be read by people who lived generations later, in different places, speaking different languages. The voice of the past, so long silent, could now speak, and the past could answer back. The dead could testify. Contracts made decades earlier could be consulted and enforced. Laws promulgated by long-dead kings could still command obedience. Stories told by ancient bards could be read and retold by people who had never met them. Walking through a museum collection of Sumerian tablets today is a strange and moving experience. The objects themselves are unremarkable to an untrained eye. Small, brownish-grey lumps of clay, often broken, sometimes just fragments, covered with tiny scratches and marks that look, at first glance, like random scratchings, or perhaps the tracks of insects. Some tablets are tiny, no bigger than a postage stamp. Others are large, 6 inches or more across, covered densely with text on both sides. They're surprisingly heavy, clay is dense, and surprisingly cool to the touch. The surfaces are usually smooth, but sometimes rough, where the clay was not perfectly prepared. The edges are often broken or chipped. Many show signs of having been in fire, baked hard inadvertently, when the buildings they were stored in burned down. A fortunate accident that preserved them when unfired tablets would have dissolved in rain or crumbled to dust. But these unprepossessing objects are words, thoughts, the direct testimony of people who lived 5,000 years ago. Not stories about them written by others, not interpretations or reconstructions, but their own words in their own writing. A merchant complaining about a shipment of inferior copper from a supplier, demanding compensation, threatening to take his business elsewhere. A father writing to his son, scolding him for laziness and ingratitude, comparing him unfavorably to his brothers, urging him to work harder at his scribal education. A king boasting of his victories in battle, listing the cities he conquered, the kings he defeated, the treasure he carried off, the temples he built. A poet composing hymns to the goddess Inanna, describing her beauty and power, her descent to the underworld, and return, her role as the force of both creation and destruction. A priest recording dreams and omens, seeking to understand the will of the gods through signs and portents. A mathematician working through complex geometric problems. A doctor diagnosing symptoms and prescribing treatments. A merchant keeping accounts of goods bought and sold over the course of a year. A woman dictating a will, distributing her property among her children. An apprentice scribe practicing the signs over and over, copying out proverbs and poems as part of his training. The The physical sensation of holding one of these tablets, if one is fortunate enough to be permitted to do so in a study collection, is oddly moving. The clay is smooth and cool, worn by time but still solid, still bearing clear impressions of marks made by a scribe's stylus. The impressions are shallow but distinct, each wedge carefully placed, creating signs, words, sentences, paragraphs. One can run a finger along the lines of text, feeling the slight depressions, imagining the scribe who sat in a dim room, reed stylus in hand, carefully pressing marks into soft clay, performing a task that seemed to them routine, mundane, perhaps tedious, never imagining that their words would survive when everything else they knew had turned to dust. The palaces they saw daily, the temples they worshipped in, the streets they walked, the houses they lived in, all gone, eroded back to the earth from which they came. But these words remain, preserved by accident of chemistry and circumstance, testimony to lives lived long ago. Uruk's influence extended far beyond its walls. Trade networks linked the city to distant regions. The mountains of Iran, the forests of Lebanon, the deserts of Arabia. Artifacts from Uruk have been found hundreds of miles away. Evidence of merchants traveling great distances, establishing outposts, creating a web of economic connections. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, copper from Oman, timber from the Zagros Mountains. All of these flowed into Uruk, exchanged for grain, textiles, and manufactured goods. The city's population was not homogeneous. There were Sumerians, speakers of a language unrelated to any other known tongue, a linguistic isolate whose origins remain mysterious. There were also Semitic-speaking peoples, ancestors of the Akkadians, who lived alongside the Sumerians, intermarried with them, adopted their gods and customs. The two languages existed side by side, and many people were probably bilingual. Socially, Uruk was stratified. At the top were the rulers, priest-kings, who claimed authority both religious and political. Below them were the priests, scribes, and administrators, who ran the temples and managed the economy. Then came the craftsmen and merchants, skilled workers who enjoyed a measure of prosperity and independence. At the bottom were the laborers, the farmers, the servants, and the slaves, people with little control over their own lives, bound to the land or to a master, working for rations of food and basic shelter. This hierarchy was not merely economic, but cosmic. The Sumerians believed that the gods had created humans to serve them, to work the fields and tend the temples, so that the gods could rest. Kingship was a divine gift, and the king ruled as the representative of the gods, maintaining order, performing rituals, ensuring that the cosmic balance was preserved. To rebel against the king was to rebel against the gods themselves. Yet there were tensions. Uruk was not a peaceful utopia. The city walls, massive fortifications, 6 miles in circumference, built of mud, brick, and punctuated by watchtowers, speak to the constant threat of attack. Other cities envied Uruk's wealth and power. Raiders from the mountains and deserts probed for weaknesses. Internal conflicts erupted over succession, over control of temple revenues, over access to land and water. War was a fact of life. Armies were raised from the urban population, militias of citizens who put down their tools and took up weapons when needed. Professional soldiers may have existed too, bodyguards and mercenaries loyal to particular rulers. Battles were fought in open fields, on riverbanks, outside city walls. The weapons were simple: spears, axes, daggers, bows. Armor was rare, made of leather or thick felt. Chariots had not yet been invented. Horses were unknown. Warfare was brutal, hand to hand, decided by numbers and courage and the favor of the gods. The mythology of later periods remembers Uruk as a golden age, a time when heroes walked the earth and the gods were close. The most famous of these heroes was Gilgamesh, the semi-legendary king of Uruk, whose story would be told and retold for millennia. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest works of literature in existence, describes a king who was 2/3 god and 1/3 man, who built the walls of Uruk, who sought immortality and found only wisdom. The earliest versions of the Gilgamesh story date to around 2100 BC, long after the historical Gilgamesh, if he existed, would have lived. But the stories may preserve memories of Uruk's greatness, of its walls and temples, of the awe it inspired in those who saw it. In the poem, Gilgamesh is depicted as a tyrant at first, oppressive and arrogant, exhausting his people with endless building projects. The gods create a wild man, Enkidu, to challenge him. The two become friends, embark on adventures, and ultimately Gilgamesh learns humility and accepts his mortality. The walls of Uruk still exist, or rather their ruins do, eroded by wind and rain, eaten away by salts rising from the groundwater, but still visible, still tracing the outline of the ancient city. Standing on top of them, one can look out over the flat desert, the empty horizon, and imagine what it was like when this was the center of the world. By 3000 BC, southern Mesopotamia was no longer a collection of isolated villages, but a landscape of cities. Uruk remained the largest, but others had grown almost as large. Eor, Lagash, Nippur, Kish, Umma. Each city was independent, ruled by its own king or council, worshipping its own patron deity. Each controlled agricultural land around it, a hinterland of villages and farms that supplied the urban population with food. These city-states were not peaceful neighbors. They competed constantly for resources, for control of canals and waterways, for prestige and divine favor. Border disputes erupted into wars. Armies marched, cities were besieged, temples were plundered. Victory was celebrated with monuments and inscriptions boasting of the king's prowess. Defeat was met with destruction, the leveling of walls, the carrying off of statues, the humiliation of the vanquished god. One of the earliest recorded conflicts was between the cities of Lagash and Umma, two neighboring states locked in a bitter dispute over a fertile strip of land between them. The war dragged on for generations, each side claiming divine sanction, each accusing the other of treachery and sacrilege. Inscriptions describe battles, treaties, betrayals, and revenge. At one point, the king of Lagash, Eonatum, erected a stone monument, the Stela of the Vultures, depicting his victory over Umma. The carvings show ranks of soldiers, marching in formation, trampling the bodies of their enemies, while vultures feast on the corpses. This was the political reality of early Sumer, a world of small, fiercely independent states. Each proud, each convinced of its own superiority, each willing to fight to preserve its autonomy. There was no central authority, no overlord who could impose peace. Power was fragmented, localized, personal. A strong king might dominate his neighbors for a time, extracting tribute, imposing his will. But when he died, the balance shifted, alliances reformed, and the cycle began again. Kingship itself was a fluid concept. In some cities, the ruler was called Ina, a term that seems to have meant both priest and lord, suggesting a role that was as much religious as political. In others, the title was Lugal, which meant big man or great man, a more secular designation emphasizing military leadership. Some rulers claimed divine descent or divine election. Others were simply successful warlords who seized power and held it through force and charisma. The ideology of kingship, however, was consistent. The king was the intermediary between the gods and the people. He maintained the temples, performed the rituals, ensured that the gods were properly fed and honored. In return, the gods granted him victory in battle, prosperity for his land, stability for his reign. If the harvest failed, if the city was defeated, if plague struck, it was because the king had failed in his duty, had angered the gods, had allowed the cosmic order to fall into disarray. This cosmic order was called Me in Sumerian, a word that is notoriously difficult to translate. It referred to the fundamental principles that governed reality, not physical laws but divine ordinances, the rules by which gods and humans were supposed to live. Kingship was a Me, priesthood was a Me. Truth, justice, craftsmanship, sexual intercourse, warfare, music, all were Me. To possess the Me was to possess power, legitimacy, the right to exist. When a city was conquered, its Me could be taken, carried off to the victor's city, transferred from one patron deity to another. Himper, though never the largest or wealthiest city, held a special status in this world. It was the religious center of Sumer, the city of Enlil, the king of the gods. A ruler who controlled Nippur, who performed the proper rituals in Enlil's temple, gained a measure of legitimacy that no amount of military conquest could provide. Kings from other cities journeyed to Nippur to receive the blessing of Enlil, to dedicate offerings, to be recognized as the rightful lord of the land. The temple of Enlil at Nippur, the Ekur, was rebuilt and expanded many times over the centuries. Its ruins can still be seen today, a great mound of eroded brick rising from the desert floor. Excavations have revealed layer upon layer of construction, a continuity of worship stretching back to the Ubaid period, before even Eridu reached its height. This was a place of pilgrimage, of assembly, of ritual so old that its origins had been forgotten. Nippur was never a political capital, never the seat of a powerful dynasty. It was too sacred for that, too important to be monopolized by any single ruler. Instead, it was neutral ground, a place where disputes could be arbitrated, where councils of elders from various cities might meet, where the will of an owl could be discerned through omens and divination. In later tradition, Nippur was remembered as the place where the gods themselves had met to decide the fate of the world. Life in these city-states followed the rhythm of the agricultural year. In autumn, when the heat finally broke and the temperatures became bearable, the fields were ploughed and the barley was sown. Winter brought rain, sparse but essential, soaking into the soil, allowing the crops to sprout and grow. Spring was the season of growth, of green fields stretching to the horizon, of canals running full with water diverted from the rivers. Early summer was harvest time, when everyone who could work went out into the fields to cut the barley, to gather it into sheaves, to thresh it on open threshing floors where the wind could carry away the chaff. The harvest was the most critical time of year. If it failed, people starved. If it succeeded, there was enough not only to feed the population, but to store surplus in the temple granaries, to trade for goods that could not be produced locally, to pay the workers who maintained the canals and walls. The harvest was also a time of festival, of thanksgiving to the gods, of communal feasting and celebration. For a brief period, the hard labor of the year was rewarded, and there was a sense, however fleeting, of abundance and security. Then came the long, brutal summer. Temperatures soared, often exceeding 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Work in the fields became impossible during the day. People retreated indoors, into the cool darkness of their mud-brick houses, or climbed to the roofs where there might be a breeze. This was the season of dust storms, of shimmering mirages, of air so hot it hurt to breathe. The rivers ran low, and water had to be rationed. Disputes over access to irrigation canals could turn violent. The cities themselves were crowded, noisy, and probably not very pleasant. Streets were narrow, often barely wide enough for two people to pass. Houses were built wall to wall, sharing sides to conserve space and materials. Privacy was minimal. Sounds, smells, everything carried. The smell of baking bread, of roasting meat, of human waste. The sound of children playing, of animals bleating, of merchants calling out their wares. The feel of dust underfoot, of mud brick walls warm from the sun, of reed mats spread on floors. Families lived in small houses, usually no more than a few rooms arranged around a central courtyard. The courtyard was the heart of the home, open to the sky, where cooking was done, where children played, where visitors were received. The rooms around it served as storage, sleeping quarters, workshops. Furniture was minimal, woven mats, low tables, a few stools or benches, perhaps a bed frame strung with ropes or reeds. Most possessions were kept in baskets or clay jars. The wealthy lived differently, of course. Their houses were larger, with more rooms, sometimes even 2 stories. Walls were plastered and whitewashed. There might be a chapel or shrine within the house, a space dedicated to the family's personal gods. There were storage rooms filled with jars of oil, wine, grain. There were guest rooms, servants' quarters, workshops where craftsmen produced goods for the household. Some houses had their own wells, or cisterns, ensuring a private water supply. But even the wealthy lived in houses made of mud brick, because that was the only building material available. Stone was rare, imported from distant mountains at great expense. Timber was scarce, used sparingly for roof beams and door frames. Everything else, walls, floors, ovens, storage bins, was made from the mud of the river, shaped into bricks, dried in the sun, stacked and plastered. These buildings were not meant to last forever. A house might stand for a generation or 2 before it began to crumble, at which point it was abandoned or torn down and rebuilt. This is why Mesopotamian cities are now mounds. Over centuries and millennia, buildings collapsed, were demolished, were buried under new construction. The ground level slowly rose, layer upon layer of debris, until the ancient streets were 10, 20, 30 feet below the surface. Archaeologists dig down through this accumulation, peeling back the centuries, exposing walls and floors and artifacts, trying to reconstruct what life was like at each level. The diet of the Sumerians was simple but nutritious. Barley was the staple, ground into flour and baked into flat bread or boiled into porridge. Dates were abundant, eaten fresh or dried, pressed into cakes, fermented into a kind of beer. Beer, in fact, was as common as water, safer to drink, because the brewing process killed harmful bacteria. It was drunk by everyone, men, women, children, usually through reed straws from large communal jars. Fish from the rivers and marshes provided protein. So did sheep, goats, pigs and cattle, though meat was a luxury, reserved for festivals and special occasions. Vegetables included onions, leeks, cucumbers, lentils, and chickpeas. Fruits were less common, pomegranates, figs, grapes in some areas. Olive oil was imported at great expense, Most cooking was done with sesame oil or animal fat. Clothing was made from wool or linen. Sheep were sheared annually. The wool washed, carded, spun into thread, woven into cloth on simple looms. Linen was more expensive, made from flax, which required more labor to process. The basic garment was a simple tunic or wrap, a rectangular piece of cloth draped around the body and fastened with a pin or belt. Styles varied by region and period. Some depictions show long, fringed skirts. Others show short kilts. Women's clothing seems to have been more elaborate, with multiple layers and more decoration. Jewelry was common: beads, bracelets, earrings, anklets, made from shell, stone, copper, silver, gold. Children were everywhere, because life expectancy was short and infant mortality was high. A woman might bear 8 or 10 children, knowing that only half would survive to adulthood. There was no schooling for most children. They learned by watching their parents, by being gradually incorporated into the work of the household. Boys learned their father's trade. Girls learned to spin, weave, cook, care for younger siblings. Only the children of the elite, destined to become scribes or priests, were sent to school, and that schooling was rigorous, often brutal. Beatings were common, mistakes were punished. The goal was not to encourage creativity, but to instill discipline, obedience, and mastery of a difficult skill. Old age was rare and respected. Those who lived past 50 or 60 were considered wise, their advice sought, their presence honored. But most people did not reach old age. Disease, accident, childbirth, warfare, all took their toll. The average life expectancy was probably somewhere in the 30s. Death was a constant presence, and the living honored the dead with offerings, with prayers, with the maintenance of tombs and memorials. The Sumerians believed in an afterlife, but it was not a place of reward or punishment. It was simply the underworld, a dark, dusty realm where the spirits of the dead wandered, eating dirt and clay, deprived of the pleasures of life. The only way to make this existence bearable was for the living to provide offerings: food, drink, prayers. A person without descendants to make offerings was doomed to hunger and neglect in the afterlife, a fate considered worse than death itself. Funerary practices varied. Ordinary people were often buried beneath the floors of their own houses, wrapped in reed mats, accompanied by a few personal possessions: a favorite cup, a piece of jewelry, a tool. The idea was to keep the dead close, to allow them to remain part of the household even in death. The wealthy were buried in tombs, sometimes elaborate structures with multiple chambers, filled with grave goods, furniture, weapons, jewelry, food and drink, for the journey to the underworld. The most spectacular burials yet discovered come from the Royal Cemetery of Uruk, excavated in the 1920s by British archaeologist Leonard Woolley. These tombs date to the mid-3rd millennium BC, around 2600 to 2400 BC, and they are unlike anything else found in Mesopotamia. The graves contained astonishing wealth: gold, silver, lapis lazuli, carnelian. There were crowns, daggers, harps, helmets, jewelry of extraordinary craftsmanship. And there were bodies, lots of bodies. In several of the tombs, the primary burial, presumably a king or queen, was accompanied by dozens of attendants, all of whom had been killed and buried along with their master. These were not slaves or prisoners of war. They were courtiers, musicians, soldiers, servants, elegantly dressed, adorned with jewelry, each holding some object related to their role in life. They appeared to have gone to their deaths willingly, or at least without struggle. Some had cups near their hands, suggesting they had drunk poison. Others simply lay as if asleep. The most famous of these burials is the tomb of a woman known as Queen Puabi. She was buried in a stone chamber, her body laid on a wooden bier, dressed in a magnificent headdress of gold leaves, flowers and beads. Around her were dozens of attendants, women in elaborate costumes, men with daggers and spears. Outside the chamber, in the access shaft, were more bodies, along with 2 oxen and a wooden sledge, as if prepared for a journey. Nearby were lyres, their wooden frames decorated with bulls' heads in gold and lapis lazuli, silent now, but once played at feasts and ceremonies. Walking through the Mesopotamian galleries of a major museum, one can see some of these objects: the golden dagger of Puabi, the lyre from her tomb, reconstructed with painstaking care. They are beautiful, but also unsettling. The craftsmanship is superb, the materials precious, the designs elegant, but they were made for death, intended to accompany their owner into the underworld, and their presence in her tomb required the sacrifice of human lives. What kind of society practices human sacrifice on this scale? What beliefs could justify it? The Sumerians left no explanation. There are no texts describing the ritual. No myths that clearly sanction it. We can only speculate. Perhaps the attendants believed they would continue to serve their lord or lady in the afterlife, that by dying with them, they would share in their elevated status. Perhaps they were drugged or coerced. Perhaps it was considered an honor, a privilege reserved for those closest to the ruler. We will never know. What we do know is that the practice did not last. The royal cemetery of represents a brief period, perhaps 2 or 3 generations, when this particular form of burial was practiced. Before and after, the dead were buried alone or with a few token offerings. The elaborate death pits were an anomaly, an extreme expression of royal power that was ultimately abandoned, perhaps because it became too costly, too unpopular, too difficult to sustain. Itself continued to flourish long after the royal cemetery fell out of use. By 2100 BC, it had become the capital of a new dynasty, the Third Dynasty of which controlled all of southern Mesopotamia and beyond. This was the last great Sumerian empire, a time of centralized administration, monumental building, and cultural flowering. It was also a time of meticulous record keeping, and tens of thousands of tablets survive from this period, documenting every aspect of the state's operations. The tablets are bureaucratic in the extreme: lists of workers, rations issued, fields plowed, sheep counted, taxes collected. They record the movements of messengers, the delivery of goods, the assignment of laborers to particular projects. Every transaction was documented, every person accounted for. The state controlled vast estates, employed thousands of workers, managed herds of animals numbering in the tens of thousands. It was a command economy, run with ruthless efficiency, by a class of literate administrators who reported ultimately to the king. The king of styled himself as the shepherd of his people, the agent of the gods, the guarantor of justice. One of the most famous kings of this dynasty was Nammu, who is credited with promulgating the earliest known law code, predating the famous Code of Hammurabi by several centuries. The law code of Nammu is fragmentary, but enough survives to give a sense of its contents. It deals with crimes such as murder, theft, adultery, and false accusations. Punishments were fines, paid in silver, rather than the mutilations and executions prescribed in later codes. The goal was restitution, compensation for the victim, rather than revenge. Nammu was also a builder. He constructed or restored temples in cities across his realm. And at itself, he built a massive ziggurat in honor of the moon god Nana. The ziggurat still stands today, partially reconstructed, a stepped pyramid of mud brick rising from the desert. It is one of the most iconic images of ancient Mesopotamia, instantly recognizable, a symbol of Sumerian architectural achievement. A ziggurat was not a tomb, like an Egyptian pyramid, but a temple platform, a man-made mountain connecting earth and heaven. At the top was a shrine where the god was believed to descend. Priests climbed the stairways to perform rituals, to offer sacrifices, to interpret the will of the god through omens and signs. The common people did not enter the ziggurat. It was a sacred space, reserved for the priesthood and the king. The ziggurat of was built in 3 great stages, each smaller than the one below, creating a stepped profile. The lowest stage was a solid platform, filled with rubble and capped with baked brick. On top of this was a second platform, and on top of that, a third, and finally the temple itself, which has not survived. The whole structure was originally over 60 feet high and covered an area of about 200 by 140 feet. Staircases led up the sides, converging at a gateway halfway up, then continuing to the summit. Standing at the base of the ziggurat, looking up at the weathered bricks, the steep stairs, the empty sky above, one can imagine the processions that once ascended here. Priests in white robes, musicians with lyres and drums, the king himself, resplendent in gold, leading a sacrifice to the god. The air would have been thick with incense. Hymns would have been sung. The people of the city would have gathered below, watching, participating from a distance in the sacred drama being enacted above them. But the Third Dynasty of for all its power and splendor, did not last. Around 2004 BC, the city was sacked by Elamite invaders from the east. The ziggurat was desecrated. The king was captured and carried off in chains. The empire collapsed, fragmenting back into independent city-states. A later Sumerian poet, looking back on this disaster, composed a lamentation that has survived. Tur is destroyed. Bitter is its lament. The country's blood now fills its holes like hot bronze in a mold. Bodies dissolve like fat in the sun. Our temple is destroyed. Smoke lies on our city like a shroud. Blood flows as the river flows. The judgment of the land perished. This text, the Lamentation for Ur, is one of the most poignant documents from the ancient world. Higher, it expresses not just grief but bewilderment, a sense that the cosmic order has been overturned, that the gods have abandoned their city. How could this happen? Why did Nana, the patron god of Ur, allow his city to be destroyed? The poet struggles with these questions, ultimately concluding that the gods themselves had decreed it, that even the moon god could not prevent the will of the greater gods, especially Enlil, who had decided that Ur's time had come to an end. The fall of Ur marks the end of Sumerian political dominance. In the centuries that followed, new powers arose: the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Elamites. The Sumerian language ceased to be spoken, replaced by Akkadian, a Semitic language that had coexisted with Sumerian for millennia, but now became the dominant tongue. Sumerian survived as a scholarly and liturgical language, taught in schools, used in religious texts, but no longer the living speech of a people. Yet Sumerian culture did not disappear. It was absorbed, transformed, passed down. The myths, the religious practices, the legal traditions, the literary forms, all continued, adapted by later civilizations, woven into the fabric of Mesopotamian culture. The Epic of Gilgamesh, originally written in Sumerian, was translated into Akkadian and became one of the central texts of Babylonian literature. The ziggurats continued to be built and rebuilt for another 1,000 years. The cuneiform script, invented by Sumerian scribes, was used to write dozens of languages and persisted until the 1st century AD, when it was finally replaced by alphabetic scripts. In a sense, the Sumerians never truly vanished. Their influence echoes through history, often unrecognized. The 7-day week, the division of the circle into 360 degrees, the concept of the zodiac, all have roots in Mesopotamian mathematics and astronomy. The biblical story of the flood, the Garden of Eden, the Tower of Babel, all have Sumerian or Babylonian antecedents. The idea of written law, of kingship as a sacred trust, of the city as the fundamental unit of civilization, these too come from Sumer. Today, the cities of ancient Sumer lie in ruins, scattered across the deserts and fields of southern Iraq. Some, like Ur and Uruk, have been extensively excavated and are reasonably well known. Others remain largely unexplored, their locations identified, but their secrets still buried. War, looting, and neglect have taken a toll. Many sites have been damaged or destroyed in recent decades, their artifacts stolen, their stratigraphy disturbed, their stories lost forever. But even in their ruined state, these places retain a strange power. To stand on the mound of an ancient city, to hold a shard of pottery or a fragment of a tablet, is to feel a connection across the millennia. These people, the Sumerians, were not so different from us. They worried about the same things: food, water, safety, the future of their children. They loved, feared, hoped, dreamed. They built cities, created art, wrote poetry, sought meaning in the chaos of existence. They were the first to build cities, the first to write, the first to create complex institutions, the first to grapple with the challenges of living together in large, densely populated communities. They had no models to follow, no precedents to guide them. They invented civilization from scratch, out of mud and reeds and human ingenuity. And in the end, what remains? Ruins, tablets, fragments, but also something more intangible: a legacy, a beginning, the knowledge that it is possible for human beings to come together, to organize, to create something larger and more enduring than any individual life. The Sumerians showed us that civilization is not inevitable, not a natural progression, but a conscious choice, a collective effort, a fragile achievement that must be built and rebuilt in every generation. The rivers still flow through southern Iraq, though their courses have changed. The marshes, drained in the 20th century, have begun to return in some areas, slowly refilling with water and reeds. The descendants of the ancient marsh Arabs still build their houses from reeds, still navigate the waterways in narrow boats, still live in ways that would not be entirely unfamiliar to a Sumerian farmer from 5,000 years ago. And sometimes, after a rain, the land gives up its secrets. A farmer ploughing a field uncovers a scattering of potsherds, a few bricks, the corner of a wall. A shepherd tending his flock notices a mound that looks a little too regular, a little too deliberate to be natural. These are the traces of the past, still present, still waiting to be discovered. The wind blows across the desert, carrying dust and sand, eroding the mounds, covering and uncovering the remains of cities that once echoed with voices, with music, with the sounds of life. The sun rises and sets, as it has done since the beginning. And in the silence, if you listen closely, you can almost hear them, the Sumerians, speaking across the centuries, telling us who they were, what they built, what they believed. They were the first, and we are their children, whether we know it or not. The story of the Sumerians is not just their story, it is ours. It is the story of how we became who we are, how we learned to live in cities, to write, to create, to remember. It is the story of the beginning, and in some ways, it has never ended. We are still building, still writing, still trying to make sense of the world, just as they did. And perhaps, thousands of years from now, someone will stand where we once stood, looking at the ruins of our cities, trying to piece together our story, wondering what we believed, what we valued, what we left behind. They will find fragments, our words, our buildings, our art, and from those fragments, they will try to reconstruct us, to understand us, to make us live again, just as we do now for the Sumerians, just as we always have for those who came before. The land between the rivers remains silent and enduring, holding its secrets, waiting for those patient enough to listen, to dig, to learn. And the story continues, layer upon layer, generation upon generation, a long chain stretching back to that first moment when someone pressed a mark into soft clay and thought, this will remain, this will last, this will speak when I am gone. And it did.